Picture a grand ocean liner, its passengers lost in luxury, unaware that danger is close. Now imagine a sudden death, a trail of hidden motives, and a voyage where trust is as uncertain as the sea. In Murder at the Captain's Table, secrets rise to the surface and the killer is still among them. Get comfortable. This mystery is just beginning. The SS Elysium cut a sleek path through the vast Atlantic, its grand silhouette gleaming beneath the early evening stars. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and unfathomable, disturbed only by the gentle churn of waves breaking against the ship's hull. Inside the opulent dining hall, where chandeliers cast a golden glow upon polished mahogany tables and cut crystal glasses sparkled in the candlelight, the atmosphere was one of practiced elegance. The hum of polite conversation intertwined with the occasional clink of silver against porcelain, each guest a well-rehearsed performer in the grand spectacle of high society. At the head of the long, meticulously arranged table sat Victor Pembroke, a man who knew well the power of his own presence. He was broad-shouldered and confidently poised, his hair silvered at the temples but still thick, a sign that time had been kinder to him than to most. His wealth was evident in the sharp cut of his tuxedo and the glint of an expensive watch peeking from beneath his cuff. He laughed a little too loudly at his own jokes, basking in the attention of those seated around him, as if every word he uttered was something to be noted and admired. He enjoyed the weight of admiration, of being the nucleus around which others revolved. Eleanor Forsythe watched him with the quiet detachment of a woman accustomed to observing rather than participating. A retired journalist, her sharp mind had not dulled with time. If anything, it had sharpened, unburdened now by deadlines and the constraints of her former profession. She had chosen this voyage for peace, for a slow retreat into the anonymity of leisure, but she had not lost the habit of reading the unspoken language of those around her. And tonight, the air at the captain's table was thick with something more than the scent of expertly prepared cuisine. Her gaze drifted to Sylvia Pembroke, Victor's wife, seated at his side. She was younger than him, not dramatically so, but enough that whispers had followed their union. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, pearls gleaming against the bare skin of her collarbone. She was beautiful, but her smile was strained, her hands resting too rigidly on her lap. A woman accustomed to control, yet tonight something in her posture suggested unease. Across the table, Marion Whitby, a former stage actress whose beauty had not yet succumbed to the cruelty of age, lifted her glass to her lips with careful grace. Her eyes, dark and knowing, flitted towards Sylvia, then back to Victor. There was a story there, one that had not yet been spoken aloud, but Eleanor did not need words to understand the undercurrents at play. Charles Lennox, seated a few places down, bore the tight-lipped expression of a man barely containing his irritation. A business associate of Victor's, or rather a former one. Eleanor had heard enough in passing to know their partnership had dissolved under unpleasant circumstances. His fingers drummed against the tablecloth, the only outward sign of his simmering resentment. Julian Harrow, the steward assigned to oversee the captain's table, moved with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses with the precision of a man who saw everything but said nothing. A good steward was a shadow, unnoticed until needed, but Eleanor had learned long ago that it was often those who went unseen who noticed the most. The captain himself, Reginald Harcourt, was in his element, hosting with the affable ease of a man who had spent a lifetime at sea. His presence alone commanded respect, and yet even he seemed subtly watchful, attuned to the invisible tensions winding their way through the gathering. The conversation swirled around Eleanor, light and inconsequential on the surface, yet laced with the sharp edges of concealed grievances. It was an unspoken dance, this interplay of glances and half-smiles, of words chosen carefully and laughter that did not always reach the eyes. And then the moment came. Victor Pembroke, ever the center of attention, lifted his glass, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of conversation. To prosperity, he declared, his smile one of a man who believed himself untouchable. The others followed suit, raising their glasses in unison. The crystal shimmered as candlelight reflected off the deep red of the wine. Victor took a sip, a single swallow. For the briefest moment, a shadow passed across his face, fleeting, almost imperceptible. His expression faltered, not dramatically, not enough for immediate concern, but Eleanor caught it. His throat worked as if something had caught there, his hand rising, fingers grazing his lips, then his chest. A cough, not loud, but sharp. His other hand gripped the table's edge. Then, in an instant, the moment stretched and shattered. Victor's body convulsed. A violent, heaving cough tore through him, a sound so sudden and raw that it silenced the room. His chair scraped backward as his limbs jerked. His face contorted in a way that was not pain, but something worse. Shock, confusion, as if his body had betrayed him. His fingers, those well-manicured, powerful hands, scratched at his lips, his throat, as though trying to rid himself of something unseen. His eyes, once so confident, were wide, unfocused. A final guttural sound escaped his lips, and then he collapsed, face first, onto the pristine white tablecloth. For a breath, no one moved. Then the dining hall erupted. A gasp, a scream, the scrape of chairs hastily pushed back. The captain surged to his feet, his voice cutting through the panic, calling for order, for space. Dr. Everett Sinclair was already moving, his chair overturned in his haste to reach the fallen man. He pressed fingers to Victor's throat, then to his wrist, his expression darkening as seconds passed. Eleanor did not move. She watched, taking in the details, absorbing them with the careful precision of someone who knew that the truth often lay in the moments that others overlooked. The doctor lifted his head. "It appears to be a heart attack," he announced, though his voice was not as firm as one might expect. A collective murmur rippled through the guests. A terrible thing, yes, but natural, an unfortunate event rather than something more sinister. And yet, Eleanor knew better. Victor had not simply collapsed. He had clawed at his mouth, his throat, his expression, one of horrified realization. A man who knew, in his final moments, that something had been done to him. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched glass. This was no heart attack. This was murder. The dining hall, once alive with murmured conversation and the low clinking of silverware against fine china, had fallen into a state of eerie silence. The grandeur remained. The flickering candlelight, the delicate floral arrangements, the crystal goblets catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. But the life had been drained from it. The guests stood in clusters, some whispering, others staring at the table, where Victor Pembroke's body had slumped just moments before. The pristine white linen now bore the evidence of his final moments. The wine glass overturned, dark liquid seeping into the fabric like spilled ink. Eleanor Forsythe sat still among the shifting tide of worried guests, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had seen death before, in many forms. A collapsed body, a life extinguished in an instant. But this was something else. Victor had not gone quietly. His face, contorted, his fingers clawing at his mouth, lingered in her mind. That was not the face of a man succumbing to the slow betrayal of his own heart. That was the face of a man who had realized too late that something was terribly wrong. The stewards moved with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive as they cleared the wreckage of the evening. Captain Reginald Harcourt stood near the head of the table, his jaw set, issuing low, clipped orders. When he finally turned, his gaze landed on Eleanor, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Mrs. Forsythe," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I trust you will return to your cabin. There is nothing more to be done here." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "A heart attack, was it?" The captain hesitated, just briefly. "Dr. Sinclair is conducting a preliminary examination. Until we know more, I would prefer not to alarm the passengers unnecessarily." "Unnecessary alarm," Eleanor echoed softly, her eyes flicking toward the body, now being lifted onto a stretcher, carefully shrouded. "Of course." She rose, allowing the unspoken dismissal to stand, but as she moved toward the exit, her pace slowed. The air was thick with tension, with whispers exchanged behind carefully gloved hands. Sylvia Pembroke was standing near the door, flanked by a young stewardess who murmured something soothing. The widow's face was pale, her posture rigid. She clutched a handkerchief in one hand, but Eleanor noticed that she did not use it to dab at her eyes. A few feet away, Marian Whitby stood apart from the others, a cigarette poised between her fingers, its tip burning but forgotten. Her dark eyes flitted across the room before settling on Eleanor. A flicker of something unreadable passed across her face before she turned her attention elsewhere. Charles Lennox was less discreet. His movements were tense, his lips pressed into a thin line. Eleanor recalled the sharp words exchanged between him and Victor earlier that evening, the way his hands had trembled as he clutched a folded letter. The same letter he had later burned. Julian Harrow, the steward, was nowhere to be seen. A curious absence, considering he had been the one to serve Victor's wine. Eleanor did not return to her cabin, not immediately. Instead, she lingered along the promenade deck, the cold sea air tugging at the hem of her dress. The ship hummed beneath her feet, a steady rhythm against the endless expanse of water stretching beyond the railing. She had taken no more than a few steps when a voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Forsythe?" She tucked her. Everett Sinclair stood a few feet away, his hands buried in the pockets of his white coat. His usual professional detachment was intact, but there was something else, something guarded in the way he looked at her. "I would have expected you to be resting," Eleanor said mildly. "I could say the same for you," he countered. A pause. "You saw it, didn't you? The way he—" "Clawed at his mouth," Eleanor supplied. "Yes!" The doctor exhaled slowly. "I can't make a formal statement until I've completed a full examination, but—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. There were signs, faint blistering around the lips. It could be nothing, or it could be something else entirely. "Poison," Eleanor murmured. Dr. Sinclair didn't answer. He didn't need to. A gust of wind stirred the air, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from another part of the ship, passengers oblivious to what had transpired. Eleanor turned her gaze back toward the softly illuminated dining hall, now empty, save for a few lingering stewards. The pieces of the evening were beginning to shift, aligning themselves in her mind. Sylvia Pembroke had seemed inconsolable, but grief was a peculiar thing. It could be performed just as easily as it could be genuine, and there had been tension in her marriage. Whispers of late-night arguments. Marian Whitby had excused herself from the table before the toast. A moment alone was all it would have taken. Charles Lennox had been clutching that letter, one he had later destroyed. What had been written there that he so desperately wanted to erase? And Julian Harrow, the ever-efficient steward, had been the one to serve Victor's wine. He had done so with the ease of a man following routine. But routines could be manipulated. Eleanor Forsythe had spent her career uncovering truths that men wished to keep buried. The way Victor had died, his reaction, the desperation in his final moments, told her that whatever had happened tonight, it had not been chance. She had set foot on this ship seeking quiet, a respite from a lifetime spent chasing secrets. But the truth had a way of finding her, no matter how far she sailed. She had no intention of turning away from it now. The SS Elysium cut through the ocean like a silent predator, its grand decks bathed in silver from the full moon above, the hush of the waves lapping against the hull, and the occasional distant laughter from passengers in less troubled corners of the ship were the only sounds that broke the stillness. The air had cooled considerably since dinner, and Eleanor Forsythe pulled her wrap a little tighter around her shoulders as she walked along the promenade deck. Sleep eluded her. It always did when questions swirled unanswered in her mind. She had learned long ago that mysteries did not unravel themselves while one lay waiting. The truth required pursuit, and tonight she intended to hunt. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ship's lounge, golden light spilled onto the deck, the flicker of crystal glasses and polished wood gleaming within. The lounge was quieter now, only a few night owls lingering over their drinks, exchanging murmured conversations. Eleanor stepped inside, drawn not to the bar but to the far side of the room, where a pair of figures stood in hushed but heated discussion near the grand piano. She slowed her step, keeping to the shadows along the wall, moving with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life observing rather than being observed. Sylvia Pembroke stood rigid, her slender form taut with suppressed fury, while Charles Lennox leaned toward her, his expression equally dark. Their words were low, urgent, but even at a distance, the tension between them was tangible. "I don't care what you think you know," Sylvia hissed, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Lennox's fingers curled into fists. "You were seen, Sylvia, and don't think for a moment that I—" "Lower your voice," she snapped, glancing around, her eyes darting toward the bar, toward the few scattered patrons who were too lost in their own musings to take notice. If you say a word, you will regret it. Lennox scoffed. Is that a threat? Sylvia exhaled sharply, stepping back, smoothing a hand down the front of her gown, her composure slowly reassembling itself. No, Charles, it's a warning. A long silence stretched between them, brittle as glass. Then Lennox turned sharply on his heel and strode out of the lounge, the tension clinging to his retreating form like a specter. Sylvia stood there a moment longer, staring into the distance. Then, with a breath that trembled just slightly, she too departed, leaving behind the fading scent of her perfume. Eleanor stepped closer to where they had stood, her gaze sweeping the area. On a nearby table sat an ashtray, the remains of a cigarette still smoldering among the ashes of something more substantial. The edges of a burned scrap of paper curled at the corners, blackened but not entirely destroyed. Carefully, Eleanor reached for it, her fingertips brushing away soot until a few words emerged from the scorched remains. If you say a word, you will regret it. She read the phrase twice, then a third time, the very words Sylvia had spoken just moments ago. But to whom had they originally been written? And had the warning been a promise or a plea? Eleanor folded the scrap carefully, slipping it into her pocket before making her way out of the lounge. Julian Harrow was her next destination. The corridors were quieter now, only the occasional steward passing through as the ship's evening activities wound down. She found Julian in a service alcove near the galley, polishing a tray with an efficiency that suggested he wished to be anywhere else. He looked up at her approach, his posture stiffening just slightly. "Mrs. Forsythe," he greeted with the careful politeness of a man accustomed to handling difficult passengers. Eleanor offered a pleasant smile. "Mr. Harrow, I wonder if I might ask you something about last night's dinner." His polishing slowed, but he nodded. "Of course. Victor Pembroke's drink. You poured it separately from the others, didn't you?" Julian's hand faltered against the tray, just briefly. She tilted her head, her voice remaining light. "I only ask because I noticed it. You were precise, very precise, more than usual." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I did," he admitted, his voice low. Eleanor nodded encouragingly, waiting. Julian hesitated, lowering his voice further. Mr. Pembroke was particular. He always insisted on a special label, a bottle from his private collection kept in the ship's cellar. He never drank what the others did. "Did he request it last night?" Another pause. Then, reluctantly, "No." Eleanor felt the shift, the pull of something deeper. "Then why did you serve it separately?" Julian swallowed, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Because someone else asked me to." Eleanor's breath stilled. "Who?" Julian hesitated, but before he could answer, a voice called from the galley, breaking the moment. He straightened, his mask of careful professionalism snapping back into place. "I should get back to my duties, Mrs. Forsythe." Eleanor could do nothing but watch as he turned on his heel and disappeared through the galley doors. She had her answer. Someone else had dictated what Victor Pembroke drank that night, and Julian Harrow, whether willingly or not, had been complicit. The weight of that knowledge settled uneasily in her chest as she returned to her cabin. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake for some time, the ship's gentle rocking doing little to soothe the disquiet in her mind. The burned letter, the warning whispered in the lounge, Julian's reluctant confession. Each piece of the puzzle lay before her, but the full picture remained just out of reach. She had begun to drift into the fog of shallow sleep when the sound came. A soft rattle against her cabin door. Her eyes opened instantly, her body tensing. For a moment she listened. Silence. Then the rattle came again, faint, deliberate. Someone was testing the lock. Eleanor sat up slowly, every sense sharp, her breath held in quiet anticipation. The handle turned, but the door did not give. A moment passed, then another. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sound ceased. She threw back the covers, moving swiftly toward the door, flinging it open. The hallway stretched before her, empty, the ship's sconces casting long shadows against the plush carpet. No one. But she knew better. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. Dawn broke over the Atlantic in soft hues of gold and lavender, the first slivers of sunlight spilling over the endless stretch of water. The SS Elysium glided forward, its polished decks gleaming with the morning's dampness, the world seemingly untouched by the darkness that had unfurled within its grand corridors. A deceptive serenity lingered in the crisp sea air, belying the fact that a second life had been claimed. By breakfast, the whispers had already spread like wildfire. The tragedy had slipped into the morning air, carried on hushed voices and exchanged glances across linen-clad tables. Silver-plated cutlery paused mid-motion, tea cooled untouched in porcelain cups, and conversations that had once flowed with practiced ease were now choked with unease. Another death. Julian Harrow had gone overboard. Eleanor Forsythe stood at the edge of the promenade deck, her gloved hands resting lightly on the railing. Below, the sea churned in the ship's wake, an endless abyss of dark water. The official word from the captain's office was that Julian had fallen. A tragic accident. But Eleanor had lived too long and seen too much to believe in such things. Accidents did not leave traces of struggle. A few feet away, two stewards murmured in low voices, their attempts at discretion failing miserably. They found a piece of his uniform caught in the railing, one of them said, near the aft deck. The wind could have done that, the other replied, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. No. The wind did not clutch and tear fabric in desperation. The sea did not reach up and rip men from its deck with precision. Julian Harrow had been silenced, and she needed to know why. She turned away from the railing, her expression composed, though her mind churned. This was no ordinary murder. This was something more, an effort to erase evidence, to cut loose the final thread before it could be pulled. Julian had known something, perhaps he had known too much. The question was, had his knowledge cost him his life, or had his silence been the price? She found Dr. Everett Sinclair in his office, the morning light casting long shadows across the polished surfaces. He stood near a cabinet filled with glass bottles, his back turned as he carefully measured a small amount of liquid into a vial. At the sound of her footsteps, he glanced up, something flickering in his expression, relief, perhaps, or weariness. "You've heard, I assume," he said. Eleanor nodded. "I don't believe in accidents, Doctor. Not this one." He sighed, setting the vial down with quiet precision. "Neither do I." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You were hesitant before, but I need to know now. Was Victor Pembroke poisoned?" Dr. Sinclair hesitated, then crossed the room to his desk. He opened a drawer, retrieving a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it carefully. The words were concise, clinical, but the meaning was clear. Signs of acute toxicity present, traces of blistering around the lips and throat. Internal examination reveals hemorrhaging in the stomach lining, possible administration of a corrosive substance, further testing required. Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tightening around the page. "This is proof." "It's an observation," Dr. Sinclair corrected gently, "and an inconvenient one, according to the captain." Eleanor met his gaze. "He won't allow you to pursue it." Dr. Sinclair let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You misunderstand, Mrs. Forsythe. He's already closed the case. The official report will state heart failure." She wasn't surprised, but disappointment settled in her bones nonetheless. "It's easier that way," Sinclair continued. "A man dies at the captain's table? Tragic, but manageable. A man murdered on his ship? That's a scandal. And now Julian Harrow is gone." Dr. Sinclair rubbed his temple. "Which means we may never know the truth." Eleanor set the paper down on his desk with care. "Or it means that someone is desperate to keep the truth from us." She turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. "Doctor, did Julian Harrow come to see you last night?" Sinclair frowned. "No. Why?" "He spoke to me before dinner," Eleanor murmured. "He was nervous, more so than usual. He admitted that someone else had ordered Victor's drink separately from the others, but before he could tell me more." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sinclair ran a hand over his jaw. Someone got to him first. The ship carried on as if nothing had happened. The guests still laughed, still dined, still played their hands at the card tables in the lounge. But beneath the facade, the ripples of fear had begun. It was in the way the staff glanced over their shoulders, the way some passengers lingered in groups, speaking in hushed tones, the way Sylvia Pembroke sat at breakfast, pale and withdrawn, her fingers toying with the rim of her untouched teacup. It was in the way Marian Whitby avoided meeting Eleanor's gaze altogether. And it was in the slip of paper waiting beneath Eleanor's door. She had almost missed it. The cabin steward had turned down her sheets, her evening slippers aligned neatly beside the bed, and the paper had been tucked just beneath the threshold, nearly hidden in the soft carpeting. She bent down, unfolding it with the ease of a woman who had received many anonymous messages in her lifetime. Curiosity killed the cat. Stop now. No name, no signature, just the neat, precise lettering of someone whom every word. Eleanor studied the message, her pulse calm, steady. The threat was obvious, and it was also an admission. She was close. That night she lay in bed, the ship creaking softly as it moved through the water. The moonlight stretched long shadows across the room, and though her body longed for sleep, her mind remained restless. Then, just as she had begun to drift, a sound pricked at her senses. A creak. A shift of weight outside her door. Not voices, not this time. Movement. Someone was there. She sat up slowly, the sheets slipping from her shoulders. The sound came again, a slight pressure against the door, testing it, hesitating. Then a faint scrape, the unmistakable twist of the doorknob. Her breath stilled. For a long moment, nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased. Eleanor slid silently from the bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. She moved swiftly to the door, pressing her palm against the wood. No sound. She turned the latch, then opened it a fraction of an inch. The corridor stretched before her, bathed in dim golden light, its plush carpet muting any retreating footsteps. Empty. But she knew better. She stepped back, closing the door behind her. The ship held its secrets, but so did she. And before this voyage was over, she intended to uncover every single one of them. The SS Elysium sailed on, gliding effortlessly over the Atlantic, its passengers blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of danger flowing beneath its polished decks and glittering chandeliers. The ship's orchestra still played in the lounges, couples still waltzed, and the dining salons remained filled with the soft murmur of conversation. But beneath the illusion of normalcy, fear had begun to fester. Eleanor Forsythe moved with quiet purpose, her keen eyes studying every glance, every hushed whisper. Julian Harrow's death had changed everything. A single murder could be misfortune. 2 deaths in a single night, one at the captain's table, the other lost to the sea, could not be ignored. And yet Captain Harcourt was trying to do precisely that. Eleanor had seen it before, the way men in power clung to the illusion of control, believing that if they refused to acknowledge a problem, it ceased to exist. But she had spent too many years peeling back carefully crafted illusions to believe in them now. She needed to reconstruct the night of Victor Pembroke's death, to follow each movement, each unspoken shift, each glance that had passed unnoticed. Somewhere in those details lay the truth. She started with Marion Whitby. The former actress sat in the ship's lounge, poised in her usual practiced elegance, though the sharp cut of her features looked tighter now, as though tension had settled into her very bones. A cigarette rested between her fingers, unlit, merely something for her hands to do. Eleanor took the seat beside her without asking. "You left the table before the toast," she said casually. Marion flicked a glance at her, dark eyes unreadable. "I needed air." "You went outside?" A pause, then a small, cool smile. "No, I went to the powder room." "For how long?" Marion turned her cigarette between her fingers, as if contemplating whether to light it. 5 minutes, perhaps. I don't see how that's relevant." "That's convenient," Eleanor said. "Just enough time to tamper with a glass." The actress's lips curled slightly. "You think I poisoned Victor? How dramatic. I do miss a good performance." "You had motive," Eleanor continued. "A past with him. An affair, if the whispers are true." Marion's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in her eyes. "Victor Pembroke had a past with many women. Do you suspect them all?" "Only the ones who left the table just before he died." The silence between them stretched. Then Marion tapped the unlit cigarette against the table's edge. "If you must know, I did see someone while I was away from the table. A man. He left quickly when I entered the corridor." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Who?" Marion studied her, then finally said, "Charles Lennox. The businessman. The one who had burned a letter that night. The one who had everything to lose." Eleanor found Charles Lennox pacing near the smoking lounge, his face lined with something between worry and irritation. The moment he saw her approaching, his shoulders stiffened. "Mrs. Forsythe," he greeted warily. "You were seen outside the dining hall during the toast," Eleanor said without preamble. Lennox exhaled sharply. And I stepped out for a moment. What of it? You had access to Victor's drink, and you had a reason to want him dead. His lips pressed into a thin line. You don't know what you're talking about. Then why did you burn that letter? His eyes flickered. That was personal. And yet, you destroyed it the same night Victor Pembroke died. Lennox's jaw tightened. Listen to me carefully, Mrs. Forsythe. I had business with Victor, yes. Unpleasant business, but I didn't kill him. Can you prove that? Lennox's mouth opened, then closed. I was alone. No one saw me. A poor alibi, Eleanor murmured. His fingers curled into fists. You're wasting your time. If you want to know who had the best opportunity, perhaps you should be looking at the grieving widow. Eleanor had watched her carefully since the night of the murder. She had been the picture of a devastated wife, slipping between quiet mourning and sharp moments of cold reserve. But grief was not always honest. Eleanor spoke with Sylvia's maid that afternoon, a timid young woman with downcast eyes. A little patience, a little reassurance, and the girl hesitantly admitted that something did not add up. Sylvia had been seen weeping in her cabin after Victor's death. The staff had assumed she had remained there all night, but the maid had noticed something. When she had gone to check on Sylvia an hour after the captain's table had cleared, the room was empty, the bed undisturbed. Sylvia had been gone for an entire hour. Eleanor's mind sharpened. That meant Sylvia had ample time to do something after the murder, speak with someone, dispose of evidence, cover her tracks. When Eleanor confronted Sylvia later, the woman's reaction was measured. I went for a walk, she said simply. Alone? A delicate nod. How convenient, Eleanor murmured. Sylvia's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but then she stopped herself. Just for a second. A hesitation. A moment too long. That was new. Eleanor studied her carefully. You seem awfully invested in this, Sylvia said finally, her voice smooth, more than a mere observer. Eleanor tilted her head. That's because I don't believe in coincidence. Sylvia's fingers curled slightly in the folds of her dress, but her face betrayed nothing. Before Sylvia could respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. Mrs. Forsythe, Captain Harcourt. His expression was carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the tension behind his eyes. A word, if you please, he said. She followed him to his private office. It was a stately space, polished and orderly, the kind of room built to command respect. The door closed firmly behind her, and the captain folded his arms. You are asking questions that needn't be asked, he said flatly. Eleanor raised a brow. I didn't realize truth was so inconvenient. His jaw tightened. This ship is my responsibility. I will not have a passenger stirring fear and panic when there is no evidence of foul play. 2 people are dead, Eleanor said coolly. 1 at your table, the other lost to the sea. What do you call that, Captain, if not foul play? His mouth pressed into a thin line. You are a guest aboard this ship, Mrs. Forsythe, and as such I expect you to behave accordingly. Drop this. Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm afraid I can't do that. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. The captain's fingers tapped once against the desk. Then he sighed, rubbing his temple as if the very act of dealing with her was an unbearable burden. This ship, he said quietly, is filled with people who have paid an obscene amount of money to be here. People with reputations, powerful families. I won't be the man who drags them into scandal. Eleanor's lips curled slightly. There it was, fear of consequence. Then consider this a warning, the captain continued. He dismissed her with a nod toward the door. Eleanor left without another word. But she did not stop investigating. She had no intention of stopping. The dining hall of the SS Elysium had never felt heavier with expectation. The golden chandeliers still dripped with opulence. The fine linen still dressed the tables in pristine folds, and the hum of conversation still wove through the space like an elegant symphony of wealth and refinement. But beneath the veneer of luxury, something darker thrived, a quiet, suffocating tension that curled around the room, unseen yet inescapable. Eleanor Forsythe sat at the head of a private table, her expression composed, her mind razor-sharp. The guests, no, the suspects, were gathered around her, their postures tense, their gazes shifting with barely concealed wariness. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, the weight of suspicion pressing against them like an unseen force. Sylvia Pembroke, draped in her widow's black, clutched a beaded clutch in her lap, her fingers unmoving, too precise in their stillness. Marian Whitby sat stiffly to her right, her features schooled into disinterest, though the nervous flick of her eyes betrayed her. Charles Lennox, ever the businessman, sat with his arms folded, irritation plain on his face. Captain Harcourt stood at the far end, watchful, his displeasure at Eleanor's interference evident in the tight set of his jaw. Dr. Sinclair stood slightly apart, his presence reluctant but necessary. He had been a hesitant ally, bound by duty but constrained by the captain's insistence on order, yet even he seemed to recognize that the evening was poised on a knife's edge. A steward moved through the room, carefully pouring wine into crystal goblets, the deep red liquid glinting under the candlelight. The soft sound of liquid meeting glass filled the silence, but no one moved to lift their drink. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice light, pleasant. "Let us raise a glass," she said smoothly, "to those we have lost." No one moved. She lifted her own glass, tilting it slightly, watching as the candlelight refracted through the liquid. She did not drink. One by one, the others hesitantly followed. Sylvia's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Charles Lennox hesitated, his expression dark. Marian Whitby merely watched Eleanor, waiting. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice quiet but weighted with meaning. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she mused. "The way we never truly know what's in our glass until we drink from it." A delicate, unbearable silence stretched across the table. Sylvia's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "What are you implying, Mrs. Forsythe?" Eleanor turned her own glass between her fingers, as if studying the liquid within. "Merely that trust is a dangerous thing. We assume safety and familiarity, but as we have learned, appearances can be deceiving." She let the words settle, let them sink in. Then, deliberately, she reached forward and nudged Sylvia's glass toward Marian Whitby. A flicker of something flashed across Sylvia's face. A heartbeat, no more. But Eleanor caught it, the way her breath hitched, the way her fingers twitched toward the glass before curling into her lap. Sylvia Pembroke did not want anyone else drinking from that glass. Eleanor tilted her head. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Pembroke?" Sylvia swallowed. "Don't be ridiculous." "Then drink." A ripple of unease spread through the table. Marian Whitby glanced between them, suspicion stirring in her gaze. Charles Lennox shifted in his seat. Even Captain Harcourt straightened slightly, sensing something unraveling before him. Sylvia's fingers remained motionless in her lap. Eleanor sighed softly, shaking her head. "You see, I know what happened that night. I know why Victor Pembroke clawed at his mouth, why Julian Harrow died before he could speak. I know why someone is desperate for me to stop asking questions." Sylvia's breathing quickened. "You're mad," she whispered. Eleanor ignored her. She turned instead to Marian Whitby. "Victor Pembroke planned to leave Sylvia," Eleanor said, "but it wasn't just another affair. He was going to cast her aside entirely. He was already engaged to someone else." A sharp intake of breath from Marian. She turned, her expression frozen, her composure slipping. "That's a lie." Eleanor watched her carefully. "Is it? You knew, didn't you? That's why you left the table that night. You had no reason to poison him, but you had every reason to hate him." Marian's hands trembled against the tablecloth. Eleanor shifted her attention back to Sylvia. "But you," she said quietly, "you had more than just anger, didn't you? You had something much worse. You had fear." Sylvia's lips parted, but no sound came. Eleanor pushed the glass toward her again. "Poison is an elegant weapon, tasteless, quick, leaves behind almost nothing, and no one would have suspected a thing, if not for one small mistake." Sylvia's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. I don't know what you mean." Eleanor set her napkin down with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric before turning her gaze back to Sylvia. Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew a small glass vial. It caught the light, glinting as she turned it between her fingers. Sylvia inhaled sharply. "A steward found this tucked away in your jewelry case," Eleanor said. "A rare extract, tasteless, deadly. It leaves behind very little evidence, but not none." A chair scraped back suddenly. Sylvia jerked as though yanked by invisible strings. "You have no proof," she hissed. Eleanor didn't react. "Julian Harrow knew, didn't he?" she continued. "That's why you had him thrown overboard. He recognized the poisoning for what it was, and you knew he might talk, and so you silenced him, just as you silenced your husband." The table was deathly quiet. Sylvia's fingers dug into the beaded clutch in her lap. A lifeline. Then, as if something inside her finally fractured, her face crumpled. "He was going to leave me," she whispered. Everything we built together, and he was going to throw it away for that woman." Marion Whitby recoiled, her face frozen in shock. Sylvia let out a shuddering breath. "I did it," she whispered. "I poisoned him. I had to." Her voice cracked, and Julian, he figured it out. He came to me, said he wanted something in exchange for his silence. "I didn't mean for him to die, I swear. She broke off, shaking her head, her hands trembling now, a long silence stretched across the table. Captain Harcourt stood rigid, his expression unreadable. Eleanor exhaled quietly, then set the vial down in front of him. "I believe you'll find this evidence sufficient, Captain." He did not speak, but when he met her gaze, there was no longer resistance in it. Sylvia let out a low, broken sound as the weight of what she had done settled over her, and just like that, the game was over. For a moment, the dining hall was utterly silent. The weight of Sylvia Pembroke's confession pressed down on the room, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the faint lapping of the ocean outside, the steady hum of the SS Elysium as it cut through the waves, oblivious to the storm raging within its gilded walls. Eleanor Forsythe remained still, watching Sylvia closely. She had seen confessions before, some whispered in resignation, others clawed from desperate lips, but this was something else. This was a woman unraveling, the careful mask of grief slipping from her face to reveal the raw, desperate truth beneath. Sylvia's fingers tightened around the beaded clutch in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Her breath came quick and shallow, her eyes darting between the captain, the doctor, and the stewards who stood just beyond the table, silent sentinels awaiting their orders. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, she bolted from her chair. The sound of wood scraping against the floor shattered the stillness. The candlelight flickered as the tablecloth rippled from the force of her movement. "You don't understand," she gasped, backing away. "He was going to ruin me. I had no choice." Captain Harcourt's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Sit down, Mrs. Pembroke." But Sylvia was already moving, her silk gown sweeping behind her as she lunged toward the nearest exit. For a split second, Eleanor thought she might make it, might disappear into the labyrinth of the ship's corridors, might throw herself over the railing as Julian Harrow had been thrown before her. But she was not fast enough. Two of the captain's stewards stepped forward in unison. One caught her wrist, the other moved to block the doorway. "No," she gasped, struggling, her voice high and brittle. "You have no right!" Eleanor watched as Sylvia twisted against them, her breath ragged, her carefully constructed composure shattering with every passing second. It was not the protest of an innocent woman. It was the thrashing of someone caught in a trap they had once believed was invisible. "You don't understand," she whispered again, though this time there was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. "You don't understand." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "No, Sylvia, I do." Sylvia let out a shuddering breath, her limbs finally slackening in the grip of the stewards. Captain Harcourt stepped forward, his face grim. "Mrs. Pembroke, you will be placed under guard for the remainder of this voyage. When we dock in Southampton, the authorities will be waiting for you." Sylvia did not respond. She merely closed her eyes, the last vestiges of resistance draining from her body. The room remained motionless as the stewards led her away, her footsteps small, defeated. When the doors finally closed behind her, the tension in the dining hall seemed to dissipate, like a breath being released after too long held. Eleanor exhaled quietly, setting down her untouched glass of wine. Marion Whitby sat rigid in her chair, her complexion pale, her expression unreadable. Charles Lennox let out a slow, measured breath, running a hand over his face. Dr. Sinclair, still standing near the back of the room, adjusted his cuffs with a quiet, resigned nod. The captain turned toward Eleanor, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I suppose I owe you an apology, Mrs. Forsythe." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I wasn't expecting one, Captain. You simply did what you thought was best." Harcourt studied her a moment longer, then sighed, shaking his head. "You may have just spared us from something worse." She lifted a single brow, or perhaps simply revealed what was always inevitable. He did not argue. The dinner table was cleared soon after, the empty glasses and fine china removed as if wiping away the last remnants of what had transpired. The ship's staff resumed their duties, moving with brisk efficiency, as though restoring order would erase the chaos that had momentarily reigned. But Eleanor knew better. She had spent her career uncovering secrets, peeling back the layers of carefully built facades to reveal the uncomfortable truths beneath. And she had no illusions about the nature of the world. People killed for many reasons: love, jealousy, desperation, fear. Sylvia Pembroke had killed for survival, and now justice would follow her to shore. Eleanor did not linger in the dining hall. She took her leave as the hum of conversation began to rise again, the other passengers already beginning to weave their own versions of what had happened. By morning, the story would take on a life of its own, shifting with each retelling. The truth would warp, soften, twist into something more palatable for those who wished to forget. But Eleanor did not forget. By the time she returned to her cabin, the Elysium had settled once more into its gentle, rhythmic sway. She removed her gloves, placing them neatly on the dressing table, before unpinning her hair with slow, methodical movements. The night was quiet now, save for the whisper of the waves beyond the porthole. Through the glass, the moon hung low over the water, casting a silver path across the vast, endless sea. For the first time since the night Victor Pembroke had collapsed at the captain's table, Eleanor allowed herself to relax. The ship had given up its secrets. The voyage would continue. And Eleanor Forsythe, for the first time in days, would finally sleep.